Keanu Reeves, known for his humility and generosity, was walking the streets of Los Angeles disguised as a homeless man. His worn-out clothes and unkempt appearance made him nearly unrecognizable, but he had a mission to test how people truly treat those in need. When he walked into a busy McDonald's, no one could have imagined what was about to happen. What he experienced there would change lives, and his perspective too. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story for you. Keanu Reeves was sitting on a park bench, observing the people around him. He reflected on the lack of empathy in the world, something that deeply troubled him. Small acts of kindness, which he had experienced himself, showed how simple gestures could impact lives, yet they seemed increasingly rare. In a recent conversation with a friend, an idea emerged: what if I put myself in the shoes of those living on the margins of society? Driven by this question, he decided to disguise himself as a homeless person to understand how others truly treat those who are often overlooked. He dressed in worn-out clothes, scruffed up his beard, and grabbed a plastic bag with a few belongings. His destination was a busy McDonald's, where he could observe people's reactions. The plan was set. As he walked to the location, he had no idea this experience would change more than just his perspective. The McDonald's was running its usual rhythm that evening. People came and went, families chatted excitedly, and tired workers enjoyed a quick meal. The counter line flowed efficiently, and the staff moved with the practiced precision of those who do it every day. For most, it was just another night. When Keanu entered, his disguise made him a stark contrast to the clean and organized setting of the restaurant. His worn-out and disheveled clothes caught some attention, albeit briefly. Curious glances followed him as he walked to the counter. Low whispers began to spread among the customers, but Keanu seemed immune to it. He walked calmly, holding a small plastic bag, and stopped in front of the cashier, Clara. Clara noticed him immediately. Despite her professional smile, she couldn't hide her surprise at seeing him. Her gaze instinctively went to his worn-out clothes and tired expression, but she quickly tried to regain her composure. "Good evening, may I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but slightly hesitant. Keanu placed a few coins on the counter. "A simple hamburger, please," he said calmly. Clara looked at the money and almost instinctively counted the coins. The amount was far less than what was needed. For a moment, she looked at Keanu, then at the money, and stayed silent. He seemed calm, but there was something in his eyes that conveyed exhaustion and quiet dignity. Clara felt a lump in her throat. It wasn't uncommon for people struggling to show up, but this man seemed different. "Sir," she began, searching for the right words, "this isn't enough for a hamburger." Keanu tilted his head slightly, as if he had already expected that response. "It's all I have," he replied, with no drama, just a simple statement. Clara hesitated. She knew her manager, Coleman, wouldn't tolerate bending the rules, but at the same time, it was impossible to ignore the situation. She glanced at the tray where canceled or mistaken orders were placed. There was a hamburger there, about to be discarded. A simple gesture could resolve this. She was about to grab the hamburger when a cold, authoritative voice interrupted. "What's going on here?" Coleman had emerged from his office in the back. He was a tall man with a rigid posture and a pragmatic gaze. His suit was immaculate, and his manager badge gleamed under the restaurant lights. He walked to the counter with firm steps, his face laden with impatience. Upon noticing Keanu, his expression shifted to something bordering on disdain. "Why is he still here?" Coleman asked, looking directly at Clara. Clara tried to explain, but was interrupted by Coleman, who turned his gaze to Keanu. "You want a hamburger?" he asked sarcastically. "Then pay for it. If you don't have money, you can't stay here. It's that simple." Keanu remained calm in the face of Coleman's words. He didn't react, simply glancing at Clara, who looked uncomfortable. "He's not causing any trouble, sir," Clara tried to argue, her voice hesitant. "The problem, Clara, is that this restaurant is no place for people who can't pay," Coleman replied coldly. If he doesn't have money, he shouldn't have even walked in. Coleman's words echoed through the restaurant. Some nearby customers watched the scene with curiosity, while others pretended not to hear. The tension grew, but Coleman seemed impervious to any discomfort. To him, rules were rules, and he was confident he was in the right. Clara looked at Keanu. He remained silent, his head slightly lowered, as if unwilling to prolong the situation. But there was something in his eyes, a mix of resignation and a hint of curiosity, that made her make a decision. When Coleman turned his back to return to the office, Clara, driven by an instinct for compassion, grabbed the hamburger from the tray of canceled orders. "Here, please take this," she said, extending the burger to Keanu. Before Keanu could thank her, Coleman returned to the counter, drawn by the movement. Seeing Clara hand over the hamburger, he froze for a second. Then, his expression turned to pure fury. "Clara," he yelled, his voice slicing through the room like a blade. "What do you think you're doing?" Clara stepped back, startled by his reaction. I was just helping," she stammered. "Helping?" Coleman repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm and disdain. "Do you think this is a charity? I already said he shouldn't be here, and now you break company rules to give him food?" "That hamburger was going to be thrown away anyway," Clara argued, trying to justify her action. "He's hungry. What's the harm?" Coleman crossed his arms, his cold gaze fixed on Clara. "The harm, Clara, is that rules exist for a reason. If every employee here decides to ignore the rules whenever they feel like it's the right thing, this place becomes chaos." He turned to Keanu, who was still holding the hamburger. "And you," he said with clear disdain, "eat it quickly and leave. I don't want to see you here again." The restaurant fell silent. Some people looked at Coleman with disapproval, while others stayed quiet, avoiding any involvement. Keanu glanced at Clara, and with a slight nod, thanked her. But something about his demeanor suggested he was far from done with this interaction. Coleman looked at Clara again, fury evident in his expression. What he was about to say would completely change the course of that evening, and no one in the restaurant was prepared for the impact of what was coming. The air inside the restaurant grew heavier with every passing second. The constant sound of fryers and orders being prepared in the background now seemed distant, muffled by the rising tension at the counter. Coleman stood with his arms crossed, his posture exuding authority. On the other side, Clara tried to maintain her composure, though her heart raced. Keanu, silent, continued observing. His calm demeanor was a sharp contrast to the evident irritation of the manager. "Clara, do you understand what you just did?" Coleman asked, pointing to the burger in Keanu's hands. His voice was cold, almost condescending, as if speaking to a child. "You didn't just break a company rule. You set a precedent. And if every employee here starts doing what you just did, this place will spiral into chaos." Clara swallowed hard but didn't respond. She knew that for Coleman, the argument wasn't about a burger, it was about control. His need to assert authority to feel in charge was evident. "That's not how things work," Coleman continued, deliberately ignoring Keanu. "That's not how society works. If he doesn't have money, he can't eat here. End of story." Keanu took a small step forward, drawing Coleman's attention. "Don't you think you're overreacting?" he asked, his voice low but firm. The manager looked at him as if he were an insect underfoot. He let out a short, dry laugh. "You have no right to talk about overreacting," Coleman shot back. "You walked in here without money and expect people to feel sorry for you. That's not how the world works. Work, earn your money, and come back when you can pay." Keanu held Coleman's gaze but said nothing. He had anticipated this kind of reaction, but hearing those words laced with disdain still unsettled him. Meanwhile, Clara felt a wave of indignation rise within her. She looked at Coleman, her voice shaking with emotion. "He just wanted something that was going to be thrown away," she said, her voice louder than she intended. "That doesn't break any rule. It's not like I gave away free food. I just stopped it from being wasted." Coleman turned to her, his eyes narrowing. His patience seemed to be wearing thin. You don't decide what is or isn't against the rules, Clara, he said, each word dripping with coldness. You're just an employee. Your job is to follow orders, not question them. The murmur in the restaurant grew louder again. Customers whispered among themselves, torn between supporting Clara and staying out of the drama. Some appeared uncomfortable, while others looked at Coleman with disdain. A woman sitting with 2 children whispered to her husband, "He's being cruel. It's just a burger." Others, however, hesitated to take sides. An older man near the counter shook his head in disapproval. "It's not that simple," he muttered. "Rules are rules." Clara noticed the glances around her but didn't back down. She knew she was taking a risk, but she also knew she couldn't ignore what her heart was telling her. "Maybe rules like this need to be questioned," she replied, her voice trembling slightly but filled with determination. "Because it makes no sense to throw away food while someone's hungry." Coleman laughed again, a short, humorless sound. "Do you think you're changing the world with that speech?" he retorted. "Reality isn't as simple as you want it to be. People like him," he gestured toward Keanu with clear disdain, "don't need compassion. They need responsibility. He needs to learn to take care of himself, not rely on others' kindness." Keanu remained calm, but something in his eyes shifted. Those words seemed to trigger something he'd been holding back. "People like me?" he asked with a faint smile. "Do you really believe that?" Coleman turned to him, confused. "What are you trying to say?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you know who I am just because I'm wearing worn-out clothes and have a few coins in my pocket?" Keanu replied, "And because of that, you think you have the right to treat me as if I'm less than you." The entire room seemed frozen. All eyes were fixed on Keanu and Coleman. Clara, who had been carrying the argument alone, felt a moment of relief seeing Keanu take the lead. Coleman crossed his arms, trying to maintain his authoritative posture. "I don't care who you are," he said. "What matters is that in this restaurant, you follow the rules. If you don't have money, you don't eat here. Simple as that." Keanu smiled again, but this time there was something different in his expression. He stepped closer to Coleman, standing just a few feet away. "Maybe you should reconsider how you define someone's worth," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Because so far, the only value you seem to recognize is money." Coleman remained silent for a moment, surprised by Keanu's audacity. But he quickly regained his composure and responded with sarcasm. "And who do you think you are to lecture me about morality? A beggar who walked in here without money and thinks he can teach me how to do my job?" Before Keanu could respond, Clara intervened. "He's a person. That should be enough." The restaurant fell into absolute silence. Clara looked directly at Coleman, her eyes full of determination. She knew she was pushing her limits, but she couldn't hold back anymore. "If you can't understand that, maybe you shouldn't be managing anything." Coleman opened his mouth to respond but closed it again. For a moment, it seemed as though he had lost his words. He stared at Clara with a mix of fury and disbelief while Keanu remained silent, watching everything unfold. The entire restaurant held its breath, waiting for Coleman's reaction. What he said or did next would determine the course of the night, and no one was prepared for the impact of his response. The silence in the restaurant was deafening. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what Coleman would do next. His eyes were locked on Clara, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He couldn't stand being challenged, least of all in front of customers and employees. To him, this moment was more than just a matter of discipline, it was about power. He stepped closer, his face now mere inches from Clara's. His voice came out low, seething with barely contained anger. "Do you think you can tell me how to do my job, Clara?" he asked, leaning slightly toward her. "Do you think you're above this company's rules?" Clara stood her ground, but she could feel her hands trembling at her sides. She took a deep breath before answering, trying to control the emotion threatening to spill over. "I just think some rules are unfair," she said firmly. And sometimes doing what's right means breaking them. Coleman laughed, a harsh and cutting sound. Well, if you can't follow the rules, maybe this isn't the place for you, he said, straightening up again. You're fired. The words echoed through the restaurant, leaving everyone stunned. Clara's eyes widened as she felt a knot tighten in her throat. For a moment, she couldn't say anything. Coleman's words had struck at the core of her deepest fears, but they had also ignited something within her, a spark of indignation and resolve. You're firing me for giving away a burger that was going to be thrown out? She asked, her voice filled with disbelief. No, Coleman replied coldly. I'm firing you for disrespecting the rules and questioning my authority. And that's something I won't tolerate. Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and looked Coleman directly in the eye. Then I'd rather lose my job than ignore my conscience, she said, her voice brimming with conviction. The entire restaurant erupted in murmurs. Customers began talking among themselves, some voicing support for Clara, while others simply watched the unfolding drama with curiosity. Coleman, however, seemed unfazed. To him, this was nothing more than an example of discipline being enforced. Keanu, who had remained silent until now, finally stepped forward. He placed the burger on the counter and looked directly at Coleman. You know what you're doing is wrong, he said, his voice calm but laden with authority. You're not just being cruel, you're showing everyone here that you'd rather follow rules blindly than treat people with humanity, Keanu said, his voice calm yet firm. Coleman laughed again, but there was a flicker of unease in his demeanor. And who are you to tell me how I should act? He asked, trying to regain control of the situation. You're just a man who couldn't afford a burger. Keanu stayed silent for a moment, letting Coleman's words hang in the air. Then, he gave a small smile, turned, and walked toward the restroom. Everyone watched in confusion as he disappeared behind the door. A few moments later, he emerged, no longer wearing the tattered clothes and scruffy beard. His hair was neatly styled, and his real identity was revealed. The restaurant seemed to freeze. The unmistakable face of Keanu Reeves appeared before them, and a stunned silence fell over the room. All eyes were fixed on him. What he said or did next would not only change the situation in the restaurant but also the lives of everyone there. The silence in the restaurant was almost tangible. Coleman, Clara, and every customer stared in shock, trying to process what they were seeing. The man Coleman had humiliated and treated with contempt wasn't just anyone, it was Keanu Reeves, one of Hollywood's most recognizable faces, revered not only for his talent but for his humility and kindness. Coleman blinked, bewildered, as if his mind refused to accept the reality before him. This has to be some kind of joke, he stammered, his voice faltering for the first time. Keanu, now without his disguise, looked directly at Coleman. His face was calm, but his eyes reflected something deeper, a mixture of disappointment and resolve. It's no joke, he said, his voice low but firm. It's a lesson. The customers began whispering among themselves, many instantly recognizing Keanu. A few pulled out their phones to snap pictures or record the moment, but no one dared to interrupt. Clara stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, still processing what was happening. I came here to understand how people in vulnerable situations are treated, Keanu continued, his tone steady. And you gave me the answer. Coleman regained some of his composure, but the shock was still evident on his face. Look, I didn't know who you were, he said, scrambling to justify his actions. If I had known. Keanu raised a hand, cutting him off. That's exactly the problem, Keanu said. You shouldn't treat someone with respect because you know who they are. Everyone deserves dignity, regardless of their appearance or circumstances. Keanu's words reverberated through the restaurant, leaving many customers visibly uncomfortable. Some averted their eyes, while others nodded silently, acknowledging the truth of his statement. Clara, however, felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over her, realizing someone was on her side. Clara, Keanu said, turning to her. Thank you. Your courage and compassion showed me that there are still people willing to do the right thing, even when it means facing consequences. Clara opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. She simply nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. Coleman, meanwhile, looked increasingly uneasy. He glanced around, realizing the customers were now clearly siding with Keanu and Clara. I was just following the rules, he muttered, trying to defend himself. That's how things work. Keanu looked at him, his gaze calm yet piercing. Maybe it's time to change how things work, he replied. Because rules that put profit above people aren't rules, they're excuses. The restaurant erupted into a wave of applause, starting hesitantly but quickly growing. Clara looked around, surprised at the support she was now receiving, while Coleman appeared more and more out of place. Keanu turned back to Clara and reached into his pocket, pulling out an envelope. This is for you, he said, handing it to her. Clara stared at him, confused. What is this? She asked, hesitant. A way to thank you for your courage, Keanu replied with a warm smile. You risked everything to do what's right. That deserves recognition. Clara opened the envelope with trembling hands and found a check inside. Her eyes widened as she saw the amount, $50,000. She covered her mouth, unable to hold back the tears. I can't accept this, she said, looking up at Keanu. It's too much. You can, he said gently. And you should use it to chase your dreams or help others. The choice is yours. As Clara tried to process what had just happened, Coleman stepped forward. Wait! I can fix this, he said, his voice tinged with desperation. I can change the rules, start a donation program, whatever you want. Keanu turned to Coleman, his eyes serious. It's not about changing the rules now, Coleman. It's about how you treat people, and that starts with you. Coleman fell silent, his posture collapsing as the reality of the situation sank in. He looked around, realizing he had lost not just the respect of his employees but also of every customer in the restaurant. Keanu looked out at the restaurant, his face calm, but his voice filled with intensity. His next words would leave a profound impact on everyone present. No one would leave that place the same as they had entered. The restaurant was still enveloped in hushed awe, save for the faint murmurs of customers trying to process what they had just witnessed. Clara clutched the envelope in her hands, tears streaming down her face. The check inside felt surreal, an amount she had never imagined seeing in her life. Gratitude and disbelief swirled inside her. I really don't know what to say, Clara whispered, looking at Keanu, her voice faint, almost lost amid her overwhelmed thoughts. Keanu gave her a gentle smile, a calm expression that seemed to carry the weight of understanding and compassion. You've already said everything you needed to, he replied, not with words, but with your actions. And that's what truly matters. The applause, which had filled the restaurant moments ago, swelled again, louder and more heartfelt. This time, it was for Clara. Customers who had initially watched the scene with neutrality or unease were now standing, clapping, and cheering her on. Some even shouted words of encouragement. Well done, girl, a man near the window exclaimed. Finally, someone with courage, added an older woman. Clara glanced around, surprised and moved by the sudden support. For so long, she had felt insignificant in that place, just another cog in a heartless machine. But now, for the first time, she felt she had made a real difference. Meanwhile, Coleman stood frozen near the counter. His once rigid posture had completely crumbled. He looked smaller, almost insignificant in the presence of Keanu and the overwhelming support for Clara. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to defend himself, but no words came. His face was pale, and beads of sweat glistened on his forehead. Keanu turned his gaze toward Coleman, not with anger, but with a quiet, unyielding intensity that spoke volumes. Coleman, we all make mistakes, Keanu said, his voice soft yet weighted with meaning. But what defines us is what we do after we recognize them. Coleman blinked, startled by the lack of hostility in Keanu's tone. For a moment, He seemed to consider the words, but he said nothing. Instead, he lowered his gaze as if finally confronting the consequences of his actions. Turning back to Clara, Keanu continued, "You know what to do with this," he said, gesturing toward the envelope. "This money is just a tool. You get to decide how to use it to create something good." Clara nodded, still overwhelmed with emotion. She looked at the check again, feeling the weight of the responsibility it represented. It wasn't just about the money, it was about what it symbolized: her courage, her humanity, and the proof that small acts of kindness could create ripples of change. As Clara struggled to find the right words to thank him, the customers began to move. A man in a suit, who had been silent until now, approached the counter and placed a $50 bill on it. "This is for the next person in need," he said, smiling at Clara. Soon after, a woman stepped forward and left a similar amount, accompanied by a note, "Thank you for reminding us of what really matters." The gesture quickly snowballed into a spontaneous movement. One by one, customers began leaving small amounts of money on the counter, turning the space into a symbol of solidarity. Clara watched with wide eyes, unable to believe what was unfolding before her. Keanu took a step back, observing the scene with a quiet smile. He understood that real change didn't come solely from grand speeches but from collective action sparked by a single example. Clara had been that catalyst. As the wave of generosity continued to grow, Keanu turned toward the door. Just as he reached it, he paused and looked back one last time. His final words wouldn't just bring this extraordinary night to a close, they would leave a lesson that would stay etched in the hearts of everyone present, transforming their perspectives forever. As Keanu walked toward the restaurant door, the atmosphere remained charged with the energy of the previous moments. Clara stood behind the counter, clutching the envelope as if it symbolized something far greater than the money it contained. The customers, many now emotional or deep in thought, watched Keanu, waiting as though they knew he had one final thing to say. He paused near the door and slowly turned back, facing the room. Silence fell again, and every gaze locked onto him. Even without speaking, his presence filled the space, and everyone sensed that his next words would leave a lasting impression. "We live in a world where appearances often determine how people are treated," he began, his voice calm but resolute. "But it doesn't have to be that way. A person's worth should never be measured by what they wear, what they have, or how they appear." The customers who had been restless earlier were now completely captivated. Some nodded slowly, while others simply listened in silence. "True wealth isn't in what we own," Keanu continued. "It's in how we treat one another. Because in the end, none of us are as different as we seem. We all have our struggles, our hard moments, and at some point, we all need the kindness of others." Clara felt her eyes well up with tears again. Keanu's words resonated deeply within her, as if he were articulating everything she had always believed but never knew how to express. "Small acts of compassion might seem insignificant," Keanu said, turning to Clara, "but they hold the power to change lives." And tonight, Clara showed us exactly that. Applause erupted in the restaurant once more, but Keanu raised his hand to signal for quiet. He wasn't finished. "What happened here tonight is a reminder," he said. "A reminder that each of us has the power to make a difference. We don't have to be rich or famous to do it. We just have to care. We just have to choose kindness, even when it's hard." He paused, his gaze resting on Coleman, who now seemed smaller than ever. Despite everything, Keanu's expression showed no anger. Instead, his eyes reflected calmness, almost compassion. And sometimes, choosing kindness means admitting when we're wrong and changing the way we act. Because we all have the capacity to grow, to be better. Coleman averted his gaze, visibly uncomfortable but seemingly reflecting on Keanu's words. He knew that what had happened tonight would not only change his reputation but also how he viewed his role and responsibilities. Keanu gave a faint smile and turned to Clara one more time. "Keep being who you are, Clara. The world needs more people like you." She couldn't find the words to respond. She simply nodded, clutching the envelope tightly as tears rolled down her cheeks. Keanu walked to the door, opened it, and paused one final time. He looked at the customers and staff, now utterly silent, and delivered his closing words. Don't forget, true change begins with small gestures. If we all do a little together, we can transform the world. With that, he stepped out of the restaurant, leaving behind a silence brimming with meaning. Clara stared at the envelope in her hands, now understanding that Keanu's gift was more than money. It was an opportunity to do something meaningful, to continue spreading the kindness he so deeply valued. The customers began talking amongst themselves, many sharing personal stories of times they were helped or had helped others. The restaurant, once just another ordinary place, now felt like a space of reflection and human connection. As Clara wiped her eyes and prepared to move forward, something within her told her that this night was just the beginning. The kindness she chose to show hadn't just changed her life, it was about to inspire change in many others. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience.